Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you. I'm going to try to speak from the middle of the room because I think it's a little bit too distant over there. I want to tackle this topic of science and faith, friends or foes. And since I only have 20 minutes, I better keep to my script, and so I'm going to keep my script in my hand. There's been a lot of talk for a long time about the supposed conflict between science and the Christian faith. And the question is, are science and faith inevitably enemies? Are they friends or foes? Now the answer depends a lot on what you mean by science. What I mean by science is natural science, the sorts of things that are discovered by physics and chemistry and biology and geology and cosmology and so on. And this may seem obvious to a lot of people, but if you're not careful, a lot of confusion arises because long ago the word science meant something different. In the 18th century, the word science was used just to speak about any systematic form of knowledge. After all, the Latin word scientia, from which science is derived, simply means knowledge. But today, that isn't what people mean by science. The unqualified word science today means natural science, and it is natural science that has gained the tremendous prestige that it has today because of its tremendous success in describing the natural world and in spawning the technologies that we know so well. Now, I'm not going to unpack in detail what makes science what it is, but most people realize that there are certain characteristics or strategies that science has on which its success is based. And I identify those strategies under two main headings. The first is reproducibility, that different people can get the same results if they repeat an experiment or an observation at some other place and at some other time. And the second characteristic is what I summarize by saying clarity, that science makes its descriptions have a special type of clarity, which is often represented by measurement. And so that even if the interpretation of an experiment isn't completely clear, yet at least the results are clear, so we can tell whether reproducibility has been achieved or not. If you need more details about these and other questions, please do read my book. This is the shameless advertising section of the talk. My book's an examination of scientism. Scientism is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. And scientism has been enormously influential in society and in the academy for probably the past couple of 100 years. Scientism is usually implicit rather than explicit. In other words, people don't generally get up and declare an allegiance to scientism. Rather, they usually just simply presuppose it implicitly. This implicit scientism is rife in the writings of the militant atheists of this century. So to give you an example, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, writes as follows, quote, "Did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There's an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice, and it is strictly a scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter would be purely and entirely scientific methods." End quote. So that's what Richard Dawkins said. But look, the resurrection is a historical claim. The way that you establish the truth of an historical claim, like the resurrection, or, for example, the claim that Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Senate on the Ides of March, just a couple of days ago, 44 BC. These are not going to be, of course, not going to be purely and entirely scientific methods, as Dawkins claims they are. No, we're going to need to use methods that are appropriate to the claims being made. The evidence we seek for historical claims isn't mostly scientific evidence, it's historical evidence. It'll be predominantly documentary, perhaps personal, but maybe even eyewitness testimony. There might be some archaeological evidence, and all of this will be gathered together, taking advantage of our general understanding of what makes people tick, and of the culture and habits and practices, etc., of the time and the background history and the times in which the events occurred. Now, the reason why scientism is so important in this present discussion of science and faith is that the critics of belief in God are very fond of saying that religion is irrational because there's no evidence for God. What they're actually saying is that there's no scientific evidence for God. There's plenty of historical evidence for the claims of Christianity. I'll agree that neither history nor the truth of Christianity can be established scientifically. But my position is that science is plainly not the only route to knowledge. Scientism is simply a mistake. And so therefore, the most important clarification I believe we can make in talking about science and faith is to recognize that there are different routes to knowledge, and science is just one of them. If you artificially elevate science to become a monopoly of knowledge, then you undermine religion, yes, but you also undermine lots of other non-scientific disciplines, like philosophy, or the literature, or history, or the law, or other disciplines that you can think of, the arts. So my first answer to this question, science and faith, friends or foes, is this. Science and faith are or can be friends, but scientism and faith are intrinsically foes. Now, the idea that Christianity and science have always been at war is actually a myth. It was a myth that was deliberately championed for polemic purposes in the late 19th century. In actual fact, their relationship has been very friendly and supportive over most of history, both in history itself and in terms of their philosophical influence. And I want to offer you some evidence for that fact. First, I'm from MIT, and MIT is the high temple of science and technology in America. And as befits a high temple, we have architecture that is pseudo-Greek temple architecture. Now, complete with fluted columns. Now, if this were truly a Greek temple, at the top of the fluted columns, there would be the bacchanalian friezes of the drunken orgies of the gods. Instead of that, at the top of our fluted columns, what we have are the names engraved of the great scientists and some engineers over history. And some would say that the drunken orgies take place across the river in the frats. So a little while ago, some of us decided we'd try to make an estimate of the influence of Christians in historical science by saying, of the scientists who are written on MIT's architecture, what fraction of them were Christian? It's hard to estimate, but roughly speaking, the estimate that we came up with is 50 or 60%. Any list of the giants of science over history would include Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Boyle, Pascal, Newton, Faraday, Maxwell. And the remarkable thing about all of those giants of science, whose names I just cited, is that they were all deeply committed to Jesus Christ. So that was the first observation. The second observation to support the idea that science and faith may be friends is that I had observed personally over the years in interacting with Christians in academia that far from scientists being underrepresented amongst the ranks of those who are people of faith in the academy, they were actually overrepresented. And it was only later that I found out this is well attested by the sociological data. This is data from a book by Robert Waffner, who's a Princeton sociologist. And what it shows is that even though it is true that that academics are less likely to be Christian believers than the population at large in America, nevertheless, among people in the academy, it's not the scientists who are likely to reject a faith. It's much more likely to be people in the non-scientific disciplines. How could that possibly be the case if it is science that has somehow sundered the academy from Christianity? How could that be true? How could that be the case if it were true that the Christian church dogmatically opposed all of the dangerous innovations of science and thereby stunted the scientific development for years? And this brings us to the third point, which is think about why did science grow up in the West, in Europe predominantly, where Christian thinking held sway. And there were civilizations of comparable prosperity and stability, and in many cases technology in other countries such as China and Japan and India. Why didn't modern science grow up there? Well, a pretty good case can be made, and has been made, for the idea that far from being an atmosphere stifling to science, which is the mythical view, actually the biblical worldview of the West was, in a sense, a fertile cultural and philosophical soil in which science was able to grow and flourish. And it's been argued that it was precisely the theology of Christianity and of the Bible which created that fertile environment. The teaching that the world is a free and contingent creation of an intelligent creator, rational creator, and worthy of study on its own merits because it is good. And the belief that our own rationality as humans is in some sense in the image of God, of the Creator, and that therefore we are capable of understanding creation. These are all theological encouragements to the work of empirical science. And when intermingled with a desire to benefit humankind for charity's sake, this gave a kind of momentum to science in its early days that has gathered strength and made science what it is today, despite any of the strictures that might have taken place from a threatened religious hierarchy. And so I want to offer a bold counterclaim to this warfare myth. It is that science and Christianity are indeed already friends in a very serious sense. Modern science was germinated in and was nurtured by the biblical philosophy of creation. It was developed by largely Christian pioneers, and it continues to draw Christians to its endeavors today. Now, obviously that view is very different from the misperception that is popular, and that misperception still holds sway, I would say, in the media. In part it is because the media loves an argument. It loves a battle. A more nuanced view of the relationship between science and religion doesn't have quite the same kind of gladiatorial excitement that the portrayal as a warfare does. But you know, what troubles me more even than the media distortion of this is that a common misperception like this is often fed by well-meaning Christians. The opinion that established science and the Christian faith are at war seems to me to be promoted deliberately by an ongoing debate that suggests that somehow the incompleteness of scientific knowledge should be a cause for satisfaction on the part of Christians. I don't think that. What ought to be opposed by Christians is not science, but scientism. So let me say one or two more words about scientism, and especially what the antidote to scientism is. I believe that the key antidote to scientism is to recognize that descriptions of phenomena from different perspectives or at different levels can be simultaneously valid. This is actually a commonplace within science. But it needs also to be extended to the levels that go beyond science and into the human. There can be scientific descriptions, which, by the way, because of the methods of science, generally speaking, rule out purposeful explanations as an operational presupposition. But there can also be human, personal, and purposive explanations, all of which can be simultaneously true. So the way I like to illustrate this is by thinking about the human person, me, okay? It's true to say that I am an assembly of quarks, leptons, gluons, and photons. Yes, that's correct. I am also a combination of elements, atoms, and molecules. I am an assembly of cooperating biological cells, guided by DNA and RNA and so on. I'm a biochemical machine powered by bioenergy. I'm an animal, a purposeful mammal with warm blood and hair. I'm a human with consciousness and intelligence, at least some intelligence. I'm a husband, a lover, a father, a teacher. I'm a sinner saved by grace, and I'm an immortal spirit loved by God. And once you set aside scientism, this improper belief that science is all the real knowledge there is, not one of these different levels contradicts the others or takes over from the others. They can all simultaneously be true, and I would argue they are simultaneously true. Now, I've said a little bit about science, and I've said a little bit about scientism and the relationship. Let me say a little bit more about faith to close. What is faith? The anti-theists of today say that you can either base your belief on evidence, or you can base them on faith in some authority. And of course, they say that their secular opinions are rational and based on evidence, while religious people are some kind of irrational faith heads. Of course, that's more of an insult than it is an argument, but nevertheless, I will concede that the religious belief of most people, certainly non-intellectuals, is founded on an acceptance, largely, of what they're taught by their religious authorities. But it's just as true that their scientific beliefs are founded on an acceptance of what they're taught by their scientific authorities. And so there's almost exact symmetry in the situation, and it's simply not the case that science is somehow based on evidence and religion on something else. In fact, both are some mixture of faith in authority and personal experience. So what is faith? Let's consider the motto of the Royal Society of London, one of the earliest scientific societies. The motto they decided to adopt was nullius in verba, Latin for on nobody's word, or I'm not going to take anybody's word for it. And according to the Royal Society website, this motto expresses, quote, the determination of fellows to withstand the domination of authority and to verify all statements by an appeal to facts, determined by experiment. That's what the Royal Society website says this motto is aimed at. Now, I think nullius in verba is a very fine motto for a scientific society, even though actually it can't be carried through quite in the way that the Royal Society website says, even today in science. But the crucial question is whether that motto makes sense as a general rule for all of life. And I'd say it's impossible to verify all statements by an appeal to facts determined by experiment. And to pretend one will do so is a hopeless scientism. Incidentally, by the way, the founders of the Royal Society certainly didn't intend nullius in verba to be taken in that way, because many of them were Christians. They didn't rule out the reality of religious knowledge by any means. So here's what I say my Christian faith is and why I think it's reasonable. It's based on an assessment of many different types of reasons. Most of them are not scientific, but they are nevertheless logical and rational. The most important types of reasons for me personally, and I'm speaking about my own psychology as much as anything else for the moment, are a combination of historical evidence and personal religious experience. So my faith, I would say, is based on experience, but not the kind of certainty of reproducible scientific experiment. Still, that's not any reason to discount it. Like everyone else, I make small and large decisions all of my waking life. And that has to be done on minimal evidence beyond personal preference and impulse. And that, because after all, that's what it means to be sentient. And if history is any judge, it is the people who act boldly with determination and commitment, even in the face of risk and with incomplete information, who are successful in this world. These are men and women of action, we say. They act in accordance with a view of the world which is plausible but not proven. That is, they act on faith. And I think that my religious faith is quite simply that same type of principle applied to matters of God and the Spirit. Now, that isn't all that faith is, because Christians over the centuries have experienced by faith what they take to be a personal relationship with God. Arthur Stanley Eddington was one of the great astrophysicists of the 20th century, the discoverer of galaxies and of the internal structure of stars. And he put this personal aspect like this. In the case of our human friends, we take their existence for granted. We could read philosophical arguments designed to prove the non-existence of each other, and perhaps even be convinced by them, and then laugh together over such an odd conclusion. I think it's something of the same kind of security we should seek in our relationship with God. In summary, then, I see my Christian faith as compatible with science. Indeed, I believe there are ways in which science leads me to God. But it is not compatible with scientism because, quite frankly, that's a rival religion. Thank you very much. I leave it